Well, as I said in my monologue, today is the 500th day that two Canadian hostages have been held by the government of China. I just moments ago scrolled through the Prime Minister's online announcements for this day. I see he has a childlike post about it being Earth Day today, but not a word about Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor kidnapped by China. Not a word about that. Well, our next guest has quite a few words to say about that. He's been researching the subject and has a lot to say. Let's get straight to it. You know, I'm talking about my friend, Manny Montenegrino, a former lawyer to Prime Minister Stephen Harper, now the boss of Think Sharp. He joins us via Skype from Ottawa. Manny, great to see you again.
Thank you, Ezra. Nice to be with you as always.
Well, you're a fan favorite. You go deep into things. I know you've been working on this subject for a while. Let me just let you get straight to it. What are your thoughts on this 500th day of the kidnapping of the two Michaels?
Ezra, as I keep saying with you, my heart goes out to these two young men daily. They have been forgotten by the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is simply only interested in doing the easiest tasks of all, and he simply completely forgets. I understand that the President of the United States, even in this pandemic, dealt with other Americans that were caught hostages and got them released. This is a perfect time to be helping these two Michaels. We have a pandemic that began in China, that was either intentional, gross negligent, or whatever you want, that has killed hundreds of Canadians and tens of thousands in the world. This would be an easy time for the Prime Minister to say, look, those two men shouldn't be there. Those Canadians, send them home. This is not the time. They haven't even been charged with anything. I mean, can you imagine 500 days and not being charged with anything? So it's a perfect time to do it. But the Prime Minister, I'm sure they're the furthest thing from his mind. He is focused on this pandemic and in my opinion, managing it terribly. As much as, and I also say that of Ontario, the Premier's managing it not properly. And it all begins with false assumptions at the beginning.
You know, it's funny because Justin Trudeau never spared a moment to call for the repatriation to Canada of Omar Khadr, who was tried, convicted, and given a 40-year sentence by a jury in Guantanamo Bay. Justin Trudeau pressed and pressed for him to be brought home to Canada. Even to say to China, we'll put them in a Canadian prison, which of course would be outrageous, they'd be released immediately, but he hasn't. And part of me thought, Manny, well, maybe Trudeau is trying to play nice because he's got some sensitive negotiations with China. Maybe he's trying to buy back the masks and personal protective equipment that he shipped to China in February. But we see that Canada sent 2 cargo jets to China and they returned empty. And the excuse by Trudeau and his cabinet is that, you know, they didn't have enough time that they could park at the airport, some made up excuse that I see the Chinese embassy has thrown out. So my point is, it's not like being soft and meek and submissive and appeasement oriented is getting Canada anything from China. So China's disrespecting and abusing us anyways. Why not at least speak truth to power?
Well, absolutely. And, you know, Ezra, right now, the pandemic, the COVID pandemic is now occupying every politician's mind. And it seems to me, if you examine it carefully, as I have, and very carefully, that the more the actual evidence comes in, the farther the politicians are away from science and the truth of the matter. And let me start from the beginning. When we heard about the coronavirus back in January, the early estimation was the mortality rate was about 8%, 6%, 3%. That is significant. If you look at the ordinary mortality rate of the ordinary flus that exist that kill tens of thousands in the United States and thousands in Canada, a mortality rate of 0.1%. So, of course, governments should be concerned. But that was bad information, Ezra. What our governments did was we took the information from China, which of course, I would never accept any data coming from China because they are not forthright. and China's mortality rate was around 8%, that would alarm you. Then they went to Italy, and Ezra, when they say Italy, they don't mean Italy. Italy's a big country. I was born in Calabria. They mean Bergamo, Lombardy, which is a small city which had a disproportionate amount of Chinese immigrants working in the fashion industry. And there, Bergamo is about the size of Kingston, Ontario, about 30,000 people. They have a hospital that maybe with a dozen ICU beds. They were inundated with a bunch of cases, and in the hundreds, and then you'll see in the thousands, that literally died not because of the coronavirus, because they were not ready for the surge of cases. So people were left to die that would otherwise have lived. Well, we in Canada said, well, let's avoid that. And they call it, let's flatten the curve, which makes pretty good sense. So off we did. We flattened the curve, and we stayed in isolation for 2 weeks. And the data is in now, and I'm just shocked that they're not listening to the data that's there. The data back in Italy, in Calabria, where I was born, there are 2 million people there, and they have only 76 deaths. This is not an Italy problem. It was a surge in a particular town, a particular northern part of Italy. So here we are, Ezra, 2 weeks after being in isolation in March. We have data from Ontario and Ottawa. And let me give you the Ontario numbers. We bumped up our ICU units from 687 up to 1497. The Ontario Health Commissioner gave a report, and he said only 270 of those ICU units are being used. I mean, that we're well below the surge capacity. Mm-hmm. So we flattened the curve. The evidence is now that we're never going to experience an Italy situation, Northern Italy, Bergamo situation, mm-hmm. where you have people walking in and not being medically attended to. That is not going to happen in Ottawa. That's not going to happen in Ontario. It's certainly, we have enough units. I even drilled down to my city of Ottawa. We have about 100 ICU units, and only 10 are being used today for the COVID-19 cases. Only 35 beds out of 1,200 plus 1,600 beds in on Ottawa are being used for the COVID cases. So today, as I look at the evidence, we were fearful mm-hmm. that this virus was going to be a 3 or 5 or 6 or 7% killer. We were fearful of the surge, and so we did everything we can. We slammed the curve. We didn't flatten the curve. We slammed the curve, mm-hmm. and we are in our best case scenario imaginable, mm-hmm. and we're still extending this till mid-May. It's just it is ludicrous.
Yeah. Well, Manny, I don't know if you've seen what we've been doing. I'm now more worried not just about the economic devastation that the lockdown will have. And I just earlier today, I discovered a study from Alberta that for every 1% that the
sure.
Unemployment rate went up, 16 people committed suicide on average. So you extrapolate that for Canada and the amount of unemployment growth we've had over the last month, you're looking at more than 2,000 more suicides that could be expected because of bankruptcies and depression and things like that. So the economic cost is huge. The social costs of the recession are huge. And I'm worried about the civil liberties. I'm worried about, you mentioned Ottawa. I know they're giving out tickets just for sitting in park benches in Ottawa.
Yeah, no, it's absolute madness.
Sorry, go ahead.
Absolute madness. And Ezra, let's take it down to where we began. The world was alarmed because we thought the mortality rate was 3 to 6 to 8%. I would be alarmed too. I was very alarmed, but I knew that the data was wrong. And I've cross-examined hundreds of experts, knowing that bad data in, garbage in, garbage out. Mm-hmm. And I knew I was a little suspicious, so I went into it. Today, or a few days ago, the Ottawa public health officer admitted that she believes that 11 to 33,000 Ottawans are infected. We have a mortality of 25 people. That is less than 0.1%, which is very equivalent to a flu. And so I'm not as worried as I was at the beginning. So if you look at the totality of it, they're changing the goalposts on Canadians. We started by saying, hey, look, we have to flatten the curve. We can't let people that would otherwise live, that couldn't get medical attention, die. That makes sense. Now, hold on, Ezra. I'm very upset at my governments. I'm upset at the Ontario government. I'm upset at the Canadian government. I'm upset at the New York, Cuomo's government, where they all received expert reports saying after 2003 SARS, after 2012 MERS, after 2009 H1N1, they all have thick reports. Dr. Tam prepared a report where she said, here's what you must do to prepare. Governments did not prepare because they were unilaterally focused on changing the weather, unilaterally focused on global warming. That's all we heard in the last election. The word healthcare didn't even come up. So they could have been prepared, but they weren't. And I say, okay, that's fine. You're not prepared. We will go into 2 weeks isolation to give the hospitals time. The hospitals are virtually half empty. The best evidence of that is the Ontario government is asking nurses to leave the hospital posts and help in the old age homes.
Right.
Where are these nurses coming from? I mean, when I heard Premier Ford say that, that's an admission that we have excess capacity in our hospitals because they're sending them to old age homes. And so that wasn't the whole reason we did this.
Well, Manny and I love the social media, so every day I see 10 new videos made by nurses, doctors, orderlies in a hospital somewhere doing some karaoke performance, and I'm not mad at them. They're bored. They have nothing to do. The hospitals are empty, so they're just joking around and having fun on TikTok or whatever. But again, there's a cost to that. If someone was going to have a hip replacement, if someone was going to have a cataract surgery, if someone had to have some, anything other than an emergent surgery is being postponed, there's a cost to maintaining this emergency. It's like holding your breath. You can hold your breath for a couple minutes, but after that, holding your breath becomes as deadly as what you're trying to avoid.
Yeah, no, exactly. Ezra, on your point of what does it cost? So first of all, I started by saying, what is the real problem? I mean, obviously, everything you do in problem solving, you identify the problem, and then you match it with the cost and do a cost-benefit analysis. At the beginning, clearly we were afraid. We were afraid that this is a mortality rate of 6%, and if you assume that 10 million Canadians get it, well, that's 600,000, or in America, that could be 6 million Americans. That's a huge number you worry about. But as the evidence comes in, there are reports in Los Angeles County of 400,000 people that have it, and the mortality rate is closer to the 0.1% than it was anywhere near the 3%. So that new evidence should make politicians say, hey, let's hold on. Let's look at this. It's not as bad as we thought. Second of all, who's it killing? Now, Ezra, I mean, I'm caring for my 93-year-old father-in-law daily. I understand, and we're taking care of him. But I understand by the evidence that's coming in. There was one, and it's hard to get this evidence. They're hiding it from you, Ezra. But the evidence that's coming in is that at 82%, in Quebec, I saw one piece of data, 82% were in old age homes. So these are people at the end of their lives in any event. So the deaths aren't killing young kids as they did with H1N1 or younger people. It's predominantly, and if you look at the statistics in BC and Ontario, it's upwards about 75% are in their last years of life. So completely vulnerable with a lot of pre-existing conditions. That makes me think, well, wait a minute. I have to think about these facts and what do I do to apply it? And here's what we're doing, Ezra, and you made a great point. I estimated it's costing about $8 billion a day every time we delay this. And that's hard costs. I'm not talking about, as a lawyer, you know what damages are when someone does something. If someone dies, you sue for the death of the person, or you sue for the damage you sustain. The people that are having damages, and there are many close to my family, that are anxiety driven, and even as I share the information to them, the facts, they are still very anxious because the media is selling a certain death narrative. But we have about 5 million Canadians that suffer from anxiety issues. I watch the Bell Let's Talk moment. I see all the experts talk about how they care about mental health and how it's important and how we have to now give it the same respect as we do give physical health. Well, Ezra, the answer is we don't, and it's an absolute joke because no one is concerned about the mental health of Canadians, what this lockdown is doing to people, whether they're unemployed, whether they're caged, and people are becoming ill and becoming hurt. And we're talking damages of at least, if you double that, $8 to $10 billion a day. It's just absurd what our governments are doing.
Yeah, I believe it. Well, let me turn our eyes south of the border. You mentioned New York. One of the amazing ingredients in the United States is it really is 50 states that come together. And there's a lot of rights that an individual governor has to make decisions, and states fight with the feds all the time, even more than in Canada. And I think the deference is to the states. And my point for saying that is some U.S. states that never had a lot of infections, that, they're coming down the other side of the bell curve, they're deciding to get back to work almost immediately, including big states like Georgia, like Texas, states that are very sparse, that didn't have densely collected people, so they didn't have a lot of sharing. I guess what I'm saying is in those 50 United States, I estimate that you're going to be almost back to normal in probably 5 to 10 of them for sure within a week. And I think that's going to create a domino effect that neighboring states will say, hey, if Texas can go back to work, I'm in Oklahoma, why can't I go back to work? Or I'll just drive across the border to Texas. And I think you're going to have pressure, people saying, hey, can I go to work? How come my neighbor 100 miles down the road can? Do you think there will be that same momentum in Canada where places like Saskatchewan or Prince Edward Island that have largely been spared will say, all right, you boys in Quebec, you want to stay in lockdown, makes sense, but we're ready to get back to work here in Saskatoon or Charlottetown or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it has to happen. It's all, what infuriates me, and yes, Ezra, you're absolutely right, and it will happen. What infuriates me is that everyone keeps talking, I will be driven by the science. Well, the science is yelling loud and clear. It's not what you thought it was 2 months ago. It's a lot better. When the Ontario health minister says, our best case, we're well below our best case scenario. And when you talk about other provinces, I mean, I looked into this. Ezra, 4 people have died in Saskatchewan. 6 people in Manitoba, nobody in New Brunswick, nobody in PEI, 61 in Alberta, BC 87, and I recall BC had a whole bunch, and I don't know the number because I don't know why they don't produce the number. It's science, but I think more than half, maybe even, was in one old age home. Mm-hmm. So you're talking about minimal deaths of people that would otherwise have, because the biggest killer of the aged people in old age homes, and there's a lot of legal cases on it, is infections and pneumonia and things that they didn't do that was there before COVID. So it's the same thing that are killing people in old age home. There just happened to be a different name to it. So yeah, I mean, when you look at all of Canada and you sit there and say all these provinces and if you strip out the people that were very ill with strong comorbidity illnesses, you might be talking about a few deaths in these provinces, such as Manitoba and Saskatchewan. How do you shut down your whole province for a few deaths when the science is clear? Mm-hmm. And Ezra, what drives me is not anything but the science. I've been waiting for the science, and I have every science professional telling me it's so much better than it was. And the same is true in America. I have a brother that lives in Arizona. They have very few mortalities there. And what you have in America is a problem in New York, I have doctor friends who tell me that downtown New York, especially in the poorer sections, the hospitals really don't work that well and are at the capacity. The deaths are more related to that than it is to COVID, because if you swing across the nation and you go to California, 40 million people, 10 million more than New York, the death rate there is less than Canada. And we have 37 million people. So, people have to be driven by the facts, the science, and the numbers. The big problem that we had with the deaths are two factors. One is hospitals were not ready. Bergamo, Italy, and New York. Those are the two prime examples. And number two, deaths are happening of people over 80 years old in real frail and dying condition. That's the vast majority. That tells me that government should not be, Ezra, we're spending $8 billion a day every day that we wait. And I'm going to tell you something. The big difference between Northern Italy and Germany in the death rate was the number of ICU units. Germany had much less death per capita because they have 38 ICU units per 100,000. Northern Italy had 6 or 8, I believe. Mm-hmm. Well, as we're spending money foolishly, crazily, recklessly by not opening up our economies and dealing with the issues that we've dealt with professionally, we are just adding debt. And I tell you, when my kids are my age, we are going to have a Northern Italy problem. We are not going to have the ICUs. We're not going to have the healthcare. We're not going to have, because this is simply way too much money to be funded in future.
Well, Manny, I tell you, it's always good to catch up. And I tell you, you've been obviously going through a lot of research and looking at things, and I'm glad to have the new information about Bergamo, Italy. I knew some of that, but not all of that, and I appreciate you bringing us that info.
Yeah, one more point there, Ezra. I do not understand why the government in Canada has not done 10,000 random testing. And this is science. And certainly, if I had one of these scientists' ability to cross-examine, if we, Ezra, when we do a political poll, we test 1,000 people, and we kind of get the sense where the nation is. Statistically, all you need is about 1,000 people. Bump that up to 10,000 and randomly test Canadians. You will find what the Ottawa Health Public Officer said, and that is, and what they say, some experts say, about 10 to 20% already infected. And if that's the case, then our mortality rate is less or equal to that of the flu, and we should not be destroying the nation. We should not be destroying people that suffer anxiety. We should not be letting people commit suicide because they're lost jobs. We should be worrying about the rest of society, because the science is telling me this is not the problem that the politicians are telling me it is.
Well, Manny, it's so much to think about. It's great to see you, and we look forward to having you back on soon, my friend.
No problem. Thank you, Ezra. All
right, there you have it, Manny Montenegrino. He's the CEO of Think Sharp, and he joins us today via Skype from Ottawa. That's an excerpt from my daily show, The Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to rebelnews.com.